In 1720, one of the most powerful empires on earth collapsed, not from war, not from plague, but from a single company's stock price. Within 6 months, dukes became beggars, servants became millionaires, and the British government itself stood on the edge of complete financial ruin. The wealth of an entire nation evaporated in what historians would call the most catastrophic financial disaster before the modern era. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. Every ingredient of this disaster, the lies, the manipulation, the government corruption, is playing out right now in markets around the world. And most people have no idea they're watching the same script unfold. How did one company convince nearly everyone in Britain to bet their entire fortunes on a scheme that was mathematically impossible? Why did some of history's smartest minds, Isaac Newton included, lose everything? And most importantly, what does this 300-year-old catastrophe reveal about the markets you're investing in today? This is the story of the South Sea bubble. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the patterns that destroyed Britain in 1720 are the same patterns currently reshaping the global economy. But first, we need to go back to understand how this was even possible. The year is 1710. Britain is exhausted. For nearly a decade, the country has been fighting the War of Spanish Succession, a massive, expensive conflict that has drained the royal treasury. The government is drowning in £9 million of debt. That might not sound like much, but adjust for inflation and economic scale, and you're looking at the equivalent of hundreds of billions in today's terms. The problem? Britain doesn't have a sophisticated financial system yet. There's no real stock market, no banking infrastructure, no way to manage this crushing debt. The government is literally paying different interest rates to different creditors, all tracked on paper ledgers, with no organized system whatsoever. Enter 3 men who will change everything. The first is Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, the Lord High Treasurer. He's desperate for a solution. The second is John Blunt, a businessman with an idea so audacious it seems impossible. And the third is a concept that would transform the British economy forever, the joint stock company. Now, joint stock companies weren't entirely new. The East India Company had been around for over a century. But what Blunt proposed was revolutionary. He suggested creating a company that would assume Britain's entire national debt. In exchange, the government would grant this company exclusive trading rights to South America and the Pacific, territories collectively known as the South Seas. Think about this for a moment. Blunt is essentially saying, give us a monopoly on trade with an entire continent, and we'll make your debt problem disappear. On paper, it was brilliant. The South Seas were rumored to be unimaginably wealthy. Spanish colonies in Mexico and Peru were producing massive amounts of gold and silver. Surely, if Britain could tap into that trade, the profits would be astronomical. There was just one tiny problem. A problem that everyone seemed willing to ignore. Britain was at war with Spain. The very territories this new company claimed exclusive rights to trade with, they were controlled by Britain's enemy. There was no trade happening. No gold, no silver, no profits of any kind. But here's where the genius and the horror of this scheme begins to reveal itself. It didn't matter, because Blunt wasn't creating a company to make money from trade. He was creating a company to make money from something far more powerful and far more dangerous. Belief. The South Sea Company launches in 1711, and at first it actually seems legitimate. The company assumes £9 million of government debt. In exchange, the government pays the South Sea Company 6% annual interest on that debt and grants them exclusive trading rights. Investors who buy shares in the company are essentially buying a stake in both future trading profits and the guaranteed government interest payments. For the first few years, nothing spectacular happens. The company does attempt some legitimate trade. A few ships make voyages. Some modest profits materialize. The stock price remains relatively stable. But behind the scenes, something is shifting. John Blunt, now a governor of the company, is watching what happened with another financial scheme in France. There, a Scottish economist named John Law had created something called the Mississippi Company, using almost the exact same playbook. Law's company took over French government debt, promised incredible returns from colonial trade, and saw its stock price multiply 20 times over. Blunt sees the blueprint, and in 1719 he makes his move. He approaches the British government with an expanded proposal. The South Sea Company doesn't just want to hold £9 million in debt. They want to take over all of Britain's national debt, which has now ballooned to over £30 million. The government's reaction? Enthusiasm. Because here's what Blunt offers them. The government can convert its fixed interest debt into South Sea Company shares. This means instead of paying guaranteed interest every year, the government can potentially reduce its obligations while the South Sea Company raises money by selling shares to the public. But the real genius, the truly diabolical part, is what Blunt does next. He begins bribing government officials with free shares of South Sea Company stock. The king's mistresses receive shares. Members of Parliament receive shares. The Chancellor of the Exchequer receives shares. Even the king himself is rumored to be involved. These aren't loans. These are gifts, and every recipient has a vested interest in seeing the South Sea Company's stock price rise, because their personal wealth is now directly tied to the company's success. In January 1720, the South Sea Company's shares trade at £128. By February, after the debt conversion plan is approved by Parliament, they hit £175. By March, £330. By May, £550. And in June 1720, South Sea Company shares reach an absolutely astronomical £1,000 per share. In 6 months, the stock has increased by nearly 800%. The entire nation goes insane. Dukes and duchesses are selling their estates to buy more shares. Merchants are liquidating their businesses. Servants are taking their life savings, money that took decades to accumulate, and buying whatever shares they can afford. Coffee houses across London transform into impromptu stock exchanges, with people shouting prices and trading shares on scraps of paper. New investors are buying shares on credit, borrowing money at exorbitant interest rates, convinced that the price will keep rising forever. Even Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientific minds in human history, gets caught up in the mania. Newton had actually sold his South Sea shares early, making a tidy profit of £7,000. But watching everyone else get rich, he jumps back in at the top of the market. He will lose £20,000, essentially his entire fortune, Later he will famously say, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." But here's the question that should be obvious to everyone. What is actually generating all this wealth? The answer? Absolutely nothing. The South Sea Company is barely conducting any trade. There are no massive shipments of gold arriving from South America, no revolutionary business model, no new technology. The company's actual profits are negligible. The only thing driving the stock price is the belief that the stock price will keep rising, and John Blunt knows this. In fact, he's counting on it, because he's been selling his own shares the entire time, secretly converting his paper wealth into actual money while encouraging everyone else to keep buying. But there's another group watching this unfold with growing concern. By summer 1720, something strange starts happening. Dozens of new companies begin appearing, trying to replicate the South Sea Company's success. They have names like "a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage," but nobody to know what it is. Yes, that was a real company. And yes, people invested in it. These ventures become known as bubble companies, and they're offering shares in everything from transmuting lead into gold to building a perpetual motion machine. Some are barely disguised frauds. Others are simply absurd. The British government ironically sees these bubble companies as competition to the South Sea Company, and therefore competition for the bribes and share gifts that government officials have been receiving. So Parliament passes the Bubble Act in June 1720, making it illegal to form joint stock companies without royal charter. The intention is to crush the competition and force all investment back into the South Sea Company. But it has the opposite effect, because by making it harder to start new companies, Parliament is essentially admitting that most of these investment schemes are fraudulent. And if most schemes are fraudulent, what about the biggest one of all? Doubt creeps in. In August 1720, a few major investors begin quietly selling their shares. The stock price wobbles. It drops from £1,000 to £900, then to £800. For weeks, company directors desperately try to prop up the price. They announce new dividend payments. They spread rumors of massive trading profits just around the corner. They offer loans to investors so they can buy more shares. Nothing works, because the fundamental truth is becoming impossible to hide. The South Sea Company is worthless. It has no real assets, no significant revenue, and no legitimate business model. The stock price was built entirely on speculation and fraud. In September, the collapse accelerates. Pound 800 becomes £500. Then £300, then £200. By December 1720, South Sea Company shares are trading below their January price. Investors haven't just lost their profits, they've lost everything. But the horror is only beginning, because unlike modern stock markets, many investors had bought shares on credit. They borrowed money, sometimes at 50% or 60% interest rates, to purchase shares at the peak. Now those shares are worthless, but the debts remain. Families that were wealthy 6 months ago are now bankrupt. Estates that stood for generations are seized by creditors. People who borrowed against their homes lose everything. And it's not just individuals. Banks that lent money for share purchases collapse. Businesses that invested their capital are wiped out. The entire British economy seizes up as credit disappears and commerce grinds to a halt. One contemporary observer writes, "The rage of people is as great as their folly had been. Mobs gather outside the homes of South Sea Company directors. Several directors flee the country in fear for their lives. Parliament is forced to convene an emergency session. And here's what they discover when they finally investigate the company's books. Systematic fraud at every level. John Blunt and other directors had secretly sold their shares at the peak while publicly encouraging others to buy. They'd used company money to bribe government officials. They'd falsified financial reports. They'd created fake trading records to justify the stock price. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had received substantial bribes, is sent to the Tower of London. Several directors have their estates seized and their wealth confiscated. Some die under mysterious circumstances before they can testify. But here's the truly shocking part. The people most responsible for the catastrophe face relatively minor consequences. John Blunt loses much of his wealth, but he's never imprisoned. He retires to the countryside and lives comfortably until his death years later. Most of the other directors either flee with their fortunes intact or negotiate lenient settlements. Meanwhile, ordinary investors, the servants who invested their life savings, the merchants who borrowed to buy shares, the families who mortgaged their homes, they lose everything, with no recourse and no compensation. The British government, desperate to restore confidence, cobbles together a rescue plan. In the aftermath, Parliament faces an impossible situation. The South Sea Company still exists. It still holds massive amounts of government debt that has been converted into now worthless shares. The government can't simply make the debt disappear. Someone has to pay it. Parliament's solution? Force other institutions to absorb the losses. The Bank of England and the East India Company, Britain's two most stable financial institutions, are essentially ordered to take over portions of South Sea Company debt. It's a bailout, centuries before that term enters common usage. But this creates its own problems. By forcing healthy institutions to absorb toxic assets, Parliament is spreading the financial contagion. Confidence in all British financial institutions plummets. Foreign investment dries up. Trade contracts. Parliament also passes new regulations. They strengthen the Bubble Act, making it even harder to create new companies. They implement new oversight requirements for joint stock companies. They investigate and prosecute some directors. On paper, these look like reasonable reforms, but in practice they have a chilling effect on British commerce for decades, because the problem was never really about whether companies should exist or what regulations they should follow. The problem was about something much deeper, a fundamental disconnect between asset prices and underlying value, amplified by greed, fraud, and government corruption. And those problems? The new regulations barely touch them. Even more troubling, the rescue primarily benefits the wealthy and well-connected. Small investors who lost everything receive minimal compensation. Large landowners and aristocrats, many of whom had advance warning and sold early, largely escape unscathed. The pattern is already clear. The people who create financial disasters rarely suffer their consequences, and the people who suffer the consequences rarely had any power to prevent the disaster. By 1721, the immediate crisis has passed. But British society is fundamentally changed. An entire generation becomes deeply skeptical of financial innovation. The phrase stock market becomes associated with fraud and speculation. Trust in government collapses. For decades afterward, Britain's financial development lags behind other European nations. The Bubble Act remains in force for over a century, constraining economic growth. Historians will later argue that the South Sea Bubble delayed Britain's industrial revolution by years, if not decades. One disaster, one company, ripple effects lasting generations. But here's what should terrify you. None of this is ancient history. Let me show you something disturbing. In December 1999, a company called VA Linux Systems went public. Its stock opened at $30 and closed. The first day had $239, a gain of 697% in a single day. The company had minimal revenue and no profits. Within 2 years, it was trading below $2. In 2008, financial institutions around the world held trillions of dollars in mortgage-backed securities, complex financial products that were essentially bundles of debt, given AAA ratings by agencies that were paid by the institutions creating them. When the housing market collapsed, the global financial system nearly imploded. In 2021, a company called Robinhood became famous for allowing ordinary people to trade stocks easily. During the GameStop short squeeze, retail investors drove a struggling video game retailers' stock from $20 to $483 in weeks, not because of business fundamentals, but because of coordinated speculation. When the price crashed, ordinary investors lost billions while hedge funds and insiders escaped with profits. See the pattern? Asset prices divorced from underlying value. Ordinary people encouraged to invest in fundamentally flawed schemes. Insiders profiting while outsiders lose everything. Government intervention that protects the powerful while leaving ordinary investors devastated. The South Sea Bubble wasn't an anomaly. It was the blueprint. Let me give you the specific parallels because they're not subtle. First, government corruption. In 1720, John Blunt bribed government officials with free shares, ensuring they had personal stakes in the company's success and wouldn't investigate fraud. In 2008, the financial industry spent over $500 million on lobbying and campaign contributions. When the crisis hit, the architects of the disaster were appointed to design the rescue plans. Some former executives became Treasury officials. The system investigated itself and found minimal wrongdoing. Second, ratings and legitimacy. The South Sea Company gained credibility because it had government backing and endorsement from respected figures. This legitimacy made skepticism seem foolish. Before 2008, mortgage-backed securities had AAA ratings from agencies like Moody's and Standard and Poor's, the same rating as U.S. Treasury bonds, supposedly the safest investment on earth. We later learned these agencies were paid by the banks creating the securities. They had financial incentives to give positive ratings regardless of actual risk. Third, complexity is camouflage. The South Sea Company's debt conversion scheme was deliberately complex. Most investors didn't understand how it worked, they just knew. Important people said it was valuable. Modern financial products are exponentially more complex. Synthetic CDOs, credit default swaps, algorithmic trading strategies. Even many professional investors can't fully explain them. This complexity isn't accidental. It makes it harder to recognize fraud and easier to claim that losses were unforeseeable. Fourth, democratization of speculation. In 1720, the South Sea Company's innovation was making speculation accessible to ordinary people. Servants and merchants could buy shares and dream of wealth, rather than speculation being limited to aristocrats and major merchants. Today, apps like Robinhood and Coinbase have made trading effortless. Anyone with a smartphone can buy stocks, options, cryptocurrencies, and complex derivatives. This is marketed as democratizing finance and empowering ordinary investors, but making it easier for ordinary people to speculate isn't the same as making it safer. When the music stops, who do you think loses more? The hedge fund manager with a diversified portfolio and insider information, or the retail investor trading on their phone during lunch breaks? Fifth, the bailout playbook. After the South Sea bubble, Parliament forced stable institutions to absorb the losses, socializing the costs while allowing fraudsters to escape with minimal punishment. In 2008, the U.S. government spent over $700 billion bailing out financial institutions. In the broader economy, the total cost, including lost economic output, foreclosed homes, and destroyed retirement savings, exceeded $10 trillion. Not a single major banking executive went to prison. Many received bonuses. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people lost their homes, their savings, and their livelihoods. But perhaps the most chilling parallel is this. In 1720, even smart people, Isaac Newton included, couldn't resist the mania. They knew the fundamentals didn't support the price. They knew it would eventually collapse. But watching everyone else get rich was psychologically unbearable. Today, financial markets regularly disconnect from economic fundamentals. Companies with no profits trade at valuations higher than profitable. Corporations, cryptocurrencies with no inherent value see market caps in the hundreds of billions. Meme stocks surge based on social media sentiment rather than business performance. And even people who understand the risks keep playing because the alternative is watching others get rich while you stand on the sidelines. The lesson? 300 years of financial history haven't made us immune to bubbles. They've just taught us to create more sophisticated versions of the same scam. So what do we take away from all this? Takeaway 1. Price and value are not the same thing. The South Sea Company's stock reached £1,000 per share despite the company having virtually no revenue or legitimate business operations. The price was based entirely on speculation, what people believed others would pay tomorrow, not what the company actually produced. This disconnect still happens constantly. When you see a stock price soaring, ask yourself, what is actually creating value here? Is there revenue growth? Profit margins? A defensible business model? Or is this just the greater fool theory, buying something worthless in hopes of selling it to someone more foolish than you? Takeaway 2. Complexity is often a warning sign. John Blunt's debt conversion scheme was deliberately complex. It made investors feel sophisticated while obscuring the fundamental emptiness of the business. In modern markets, when you can't understand how a financial product makes money, that's not a sign that you're too unsophisticated. It's often a sign that someone is hiding something. The most destructive financial products of the past 30 years, from subprime mortgage securities to certain cryptocurrency schemes, have been characterized by deliberate complexity. Warren Buffett, arguably the most successful investor in history, has a rule: never invest in something you can't explain to a reasonably intelligent person in 5 minutes. If the pitch requires jargon, complex mathematics, or appeals to your fear of missing out rather than clear explanations of value creation, that's a red flag. Takeaway 3. When the disaster comes, ordinary people pay. John Blunt retired comfortably. Most South Sea Company directors kept substantial wealth. The Chancellor of the Exchequer spent time in the Tower of London, but was eventually released. They engineered the catastrophe and escaped largely unscathed. The servants who invested their life savings, ruined. The merchants who mortgaged their businesses, bankrupt. The families who borrowed to buy shares at the peak, destroyed. This pattern repeats in every major financial crisis. The architects of disaster are rarely the ones who suffer its consequences. The 2008 financial crisis caused millions of foreclosures, destroyed trillions in household wealth, and devastated communities. But the banking executives who created the toxic securities received bonuses and bailouts. Understanding this isn't about cynicism. It's about recognizing that the financial system doesn't automatically protect you. When everyone is telling you to invest, when the returns seem too good to be true, when complexity and jargon replace clear explanations, those are precisely the moments when ordinary people are most at risk. So here's my warning, and I want you to really think about this. Right now, in markets around the world, we're seeing asset prices that have disconnected from underlying fundamentals. We're seeing ordinary people encouraged to speculate with money they can't afford to lose. We're seeing complexity marketed as sophistication. We're seeing governments and institutions that are supposed to protect investors instead facilitating risky behavior. The conditions that created the South Sea bubble haven't disappeared. They're just wearing modern clothes. I'm not saying every investment is fraudulent. I'm not saying the stock market is rigged. I'm saying that the exact same psychological vulnerabilities, the same systemic corruptions, and the same patterns that destroyed Britain in 1720 are active today. And the next time a bubble bursts, and there will be a next time, the people who created it will find a way to survive. The question is, will you? The South Sea bubble happened 300 years ago, but its lessons are more relevant than ever, because human nature hasn't changed, greed hasn't disappeared, and the willingness of powerful people to profit from the suffering of ordinary investors hasn't diminished. The only thing that's changed is the technology we use to repeat the same mistakes. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and whatever you do, don't assume that just because something is happening on a massive scale in modern markets with government blessing and expert endorsement, that it's actually legitimate. History suggests otherwise. If this video made you think differently about modern financial markets, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the historical patterns that shape our economy today. and drop a comment telling me, what current market trend do you think most resembles the South Sea bubble? Because understanding history isn't about memorizing dates and names. It's about recognizing the patterns that keep repeating and making sure you're not on the wrong side when they collapse. Thanks for watching. And remember, the greatest scams in history all had one thing in common. Everyone thought they were too smart to fall for them.